Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the panelists and all of the participants here for joining us for our next panel at a Crossroad, Mobility and Access to Resources. My name is Michaela Reynolds, and I am a Toll Public Interest Scholar at Penn Law. This panel will focus on how transit and mobility interplay with social determinants of health. Transportation can provide connections to jobs, healthcare, education, and several other essential needs. However, as we will discuss, gaps in transportation access have severe consequences for providing these opportunities and needs for marginalized communities. The panelists here will share their research and perspectives on mobility and justice across race, income, and other characteristics, and how these gaps further social inequality. So our panelists here today, we have Professor Jesus Barajas, who is an assistant professor of environmental science and policy and affiliated faculty at the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California, Davis. We also have Professor Ariel Bierbaum, who is an assistant professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. Also joining us today is Professor Kate Ellengold, who is an assistant professor of law at the University of North Carolina. And last but not least, we have Professor Alex Karner, who is an associate professor in the graduate program in community and regional planning at the University of Texas. So thank you, panelists, for making time to be here today. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have a question during the event, please submit it to the Toll Public Interest Center through the Q&A function. We will then answer questions during the Q&A period at the end of the panel. If you would like live subtitles for today's event, please click the button on the bottom of your Zoom screen that says live transcript. Then select show transcript, and it should provide live subtitles. If you don't see that option, please send a chat to Toll Public Interest Center and we will address it. If you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE passwords will be announced 3 times during this panel. Write down these passwords and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits, and the link to the digital evaluation form will be emailed to you in your confirmation email. If you did not receive the email, if you are on the webinar and would like to receive CLE credit, please find the evaluation link form in the chat. The first password is LANE, L-A-N-E. So again, the first CLE password is LANE, L-A-N-E. Okay, so I'd love to kick it off, panelists. So Professor Barajas, Bierbaum, and Karner, you three have actually collaborated several times before and have analyzed how mobility justice helps us think about various social determinants of health. So Professor Karner, I would love if you could start us off by just discussing how the mobility justice framework comes into play in examining transportation and mobility within different communities.
Sure, thanks, Michaela, and thanks for having us here for this important discussion. So mobility justice for me, in kind of my perspective on, comes from doing this work over the past 10 years or so. And I started from a kind of very traditional frame from within civil engineering, where folks were talking about transportation equity and environmental justice, and the way that transportation equity and environmental justice were operationalized and continue to be operationalized today was really through thinking about distributions of benefits and burdens. So if we build a particular transportation project, who will benefit from it and who will be burdened by it? And I continue to think that those types of analyses and that type of perspective is important. But what mobility justice really helps us do is kind of pull the lens back from that rather narrow focus on distributions to think more about other types of impacts that turn out to be quite important. So things like gentrification and displacement, things like policing on public transit vehicles, thinking about how the decisions that we make about transportation infrastructure continue to embed relations of power and inequality regardless of mode, right? So within transportation planning, we're used to thinking about highways as kind of the villain, and I'm here for that for sure. But public transit isn't isn't a kind of unalloyed good, right? We can see from looking at the history, if we look back at the Bay Area rapid transit system and the reasons that it was created, largely to serve downtown business interests. And we can even fast forward to today. So I'm in Austin, and we're pursuing a $7 billion 30-year public transit capital expansion plan. And it seems to have been produced largely without consideration of the needs of existing riders. So it's rather created to project the image of Austin as kind of a world-class city that is ready to attract capital investment, right? It's open for tourists. There's going to be a new rail connection to the airport, but there's very little or nothing in the plan about how it's going to benefit folks who rely on public transit or the existing bus network today. The money for the project, it's called Project Connect, is firewalled from existing bus service. So it can only be used to support the development of new rail infrastructure. So I think we need to disrupt this cycle. We need to make sure that we're building public transit that creates places that we want to live in, creates opportunities for democratic involvement, creates opportunities for folks who have few options to meet their daily needs, whether it's going to work, school, healthcare, education. And so mobility justice helps us kind of see that bigger picture. And another thing that I really like about the mobility justice framework is that it connects across multiple scales. So it helps us see how these local struggles for transit justice are connected to global struggles related to the fossil fuel industry writ large, related to climate change and kind of mass migration and displacement. So it connects what's going on locally to a kind of global sense of justice. So that's why I think it's quite important and helpful.
Thank you. That is really helpful as we just kind of frame the discussion, and especially for those who may not have heard of mobility justice before, kind of the importance of using a mobility justice framework. So I appreciate your insight. And Professors Bierbaum and Barajas, I would love to bring you in and talk a little bit about your research about transportation and mobility and how they affect education here in Philadelphia. So I would love to ask Professor Bierbaum, if you'd like to start us off, how does the mobility justice framework help us think about education and education access?
Sure. Well, thank you. And thank you, Alex, for that excellent sort of framework to get us in here. I think that, first of all, we can see education and understand education as inextricably tied to movement in a double sense and into mobility. So first of all, we have to travel physically to school sites. But secondly, education as a public good is really positioned policy-wise, politically, functionally as a critical mechanism to achieve social mobility, right? And so sort of how we understand advantage and disadvantage as it's tied to our public education system, K-12 and higher ed, is actually really tied to the kinds of things that Alex was just describing in terms of mobility justice, and how that framework helps us understand how particular groups are advantaged or disadvantaged in terms of the mobility, the physical mobility they have, and also the social mobility that they have. When Jesus and Alex and I initiated this work, I will actually say that the questions of transportation as tied to education, for me, actually emanated from work in Philadelphia. And I was studying the mass school closures in Philadelphia in 2013, 14, and 15. But what I heard in that research, while I was looking at issues of neighborhood change and connection to school closure, what I heard when I talked to people on the ground were actually deep concerns about transportation. And access to new schools, and where families were going to have to send kids when their schools closed and their kids were reassigned to new neighborhood schools, and what the experience of that travel would mean, and what kind of additional harms their children would experience. And so I actually opened up conversations with Jesus and Alex, who are experts in transportation and transportation equity, and said, there's something here, there's something kind of funky going on that's being missed by researchers, but is being deeply felt on the ground by families and students in these contexts. And so we sort of launched this kind of multi-year exploration, and what we really began to understand and clarify were sort of three things on the ground, both in the research and from practitioners and community members, is that the transportation research has really looked at school travel in a pretty narrow way, which is looking at primarily active travel to school. So being able to walk and bike to school, and the subsequent public health effects of that. So issues of obesity and diabetes, sort of the increase of sedentary lifestyles and how that affects young people, which is important foundational work, but sort of one, again, sort of narrow specific dimension. As Alex started to talk about, the broader transportation equity scholarship does touch on lots of issues, certainly the distribution of risks and resources. They touch on issues of funding, some issues of public participation and how decisions are made, and lots of different population groups. So immigrants, women, low-income folks, but they actually don't spend a lot of time talking about children and youth, who are really a highly marginalized, often vulnerable population, particularly youth of color, particularly youth from lower income households, and how they navigate transportation systems in some ways are unique to an adult population. And the third factor on the ground is that the current educational landscape is increasingly defined by school choice. And this has grown as a response to inequities in funding, to persistent socioeconomic and racial segregation that results in tremendous harm, particularly for minoritized and low-income students, but I would say there are deep harms for white and affluent students who are also segregated as well. But advocates and critics of school choice actually don't really address questions in transportation in deep and thorough ways, even though the physical access to schools, right, the transportation as literal and metaphorical vehicle, is the fundamental premise by which school choice needs to operate and ostensibly facilitates education equity. And I want to note that we can have lots of debates about school choice, but when we're talking about school choice, we're actually talking about how this holds true for those who are promoting choice through a market-based lens of education reform. So folks promoting things like school closures and school competition and the advent of charter schools. But it's also those looking at choice through more of a civil rights perspective and looking at desegregation and integration efforts both within school districts and across school districts, right? And so there's just sort of a new landscape out there where the normative ideal of a neighborhood school that you can walk to, on which a lot of the school travel literature is based, that really recedes, right? And so we need to elevate new kinds of transportation analyses, and given, again, the context that Alex just described about mobility justice, the way that this extends our understanding of justice beyond just distributive mechanisms is really important, given the multi-scalar and multi-dimensional nature of public education in the US.
Thank you. And that's really helpful and just really relevant as, you know, the state is going through this school funding lawsuit. And, you know, we hear a lot about property-based taxes and how that kind of furthers inequities. And here in Philadelphia, with so many students traveling across the city to be able to go to schools and the different barriers that they face. And Professor Ellengold, I'd love to bring you in because I know you have also studied this issue, but more for access to higher education. So how do different transportation barriers affect access to higher education?
I want to answer your question, and thank you so much for having me here. I wanted to just kind of respond to what Ariel said about how I got into this work, because I study student debt, really. I study credit and debt, and I was doing a project trying to figure out whether our current student debt system had an effect on the college completion gap between Latinos and non-Latinos, whether the issue of debt aversion was causing a college completion gap for Latinos. And we did this big study, and what rose to the surface in terms of barriers was transportation. And so I came at this organically in that way, hadn't really thought about transportation as an access to higher ed issue. It went in studying this question about debt and came out with this answer about about transportation. So I really appreciated that we come at this from different places. So, but to specifically answer your question, I think that a lot of people have a picture of college students as, 18 to 24-year-old students who live on campus, live on the dorms, don't have real need for transportation. But that's not the reality of the great majority of people attending college these days. People estimate anywhere from 40 to nearly 75% of students are what we call non-traditional students. So older students, students who are parents, who have full-time jobs, who are retirees, really different from this picture of an 18 to 24-year-old full-time college student living on campus. And so for those students, there's an incredible need to get to and from campus, but also to get to and from campus in a complicated life where they also need to get to and from work and to and from family obligations. And those things create a real complex web of people have to create a really complex plan for how to achieve all of those things, which means that when transportation fails, the whole plan falls apart. For community college students, 99% of whom are commuters, access to reliable and affordable transportation is often the difference between staying in college and dropping out of college. In fact, a community college president once said that students were one flat tire from dropping out. So the way that I think about this is by using the metaphor of a Jenga game, where you stack the blocks and then you take out the blocks and whoever takes out the block that tumbles the whole tower loses the game. And if we think about the supports that college students need to survive and thrive and complete college, they need a lot of supports, right? We need family support, we need academic support, we need financial support, we need food security and housing security and all these different supports. And if you think about each of those supports as a Jenga block, when you start removing the supports, the whole tower becomes less stable and it's harder for people to complete. And after doing this research where transportation rose to the surface, what my colleagues and I discovered was that transportation was one of those blocks that when you took it out, a lot of other blocks fell too. And so therefore, it was this piece of the puzzle that once you removed it, made it very hard for people to complete college. So, examples like we talked to a student who had a 45-minute commute to college. She was also responsible because her mom worked at a factory to pick up her younger siblings from school. And her younger brother was diagnosed with diabetes, and that caused a lot of struggles for him medically, and he had to be picked up from school more often. And she just couldn't make all of that work anymore and had to drop out of college. Or we talked to another student who said she had to take public transportation to get to her after school job, or her job, I guess not really after school job in college. And she would sit in class so worried that she was going to miss the bus that was going to get her to work on time that she couldn't concentrate in class, right? Or that people couldn't get to office hours. So there's all these reasons why transportation problems make it difficult for people to complete. And we also saw that there were buckets. So it's not just financial, right? It's about schedule, time, cost, and stress, and all those things showed up in transportation barriers. So, and then we found that although the transportation barriers were difficult for all students, there was a big difference between the Latino students and the non-Latino students, such that the transportation barriers were a salient explanatory factor for the college completion gap. So it's really not all that surprising when you start to piece together all the mobility justice issues that people are doing out there. And we know that transportation infrastructure and implementation has been developed that has harmed communities of color. We know that the way automobile supremacy has worked, that it has structurally been financed to not only prefer car riders, but also to actually harm non-car riders. We know that people of color are more more likely to be carless, more likely to share cars in a family, more likely to be public transit users. And so it's not surprising, right, that transportation barriers disproportionately affect students of color who are trying to access higher education. So what I've been thinking about a lot lately is how these structures intersect. So how higher education, law and policy and program interact with transportation, law and policy and program. And what I've concluded is that higher education, law and policy has actually exacerbated rather than mitigated the transportation problems and inequities that we see. So I'll give you one example. In the Higher Education Act, the way that the financial aid is calculated depends a lot on what the school deems to be the cost of attendance. But the cost of a car cannot be considered in the cost of attendance. And so it's not accounted for in someone's financial aid package. And so to me, that is a way of doubling down on those inequities that we see in transportation. So what I'd really like to see our higher education advocates and policymakers think about the way that they can mitigate transportation barriers for their students, and also perhaps the way they can use their power to influence transportation law and policy to actually reduce the injustices that we see.
That's really helpful and insightful. And I think, you know, to your point where we really think it's easy to think that most people who are in college are living on campus and, you know, have a short walk to class. I think it's important to remember that most people don't, and you know, transportation does play a huge role in access. And kind of to your point on the barriers that Latinx students face, I wanted to zoom out a bit and Professor Barajas, bring you in, because I know you've studied the transportation barriers for immigrant populations and Latinx groups, and I would love to kind of get your perspective on some key factors that we need to understand when considering the travel of immigrants.
Sure. Thanks for bringing me in. This is a great conversation so far. So I think kind of a little bit of a backstory of what kind of drew me to this particular line of research was, again, going back to the conversation about what the data are telling us and what stories we're able to tell with the information that we have. A lot of the kind of foundational research on immigrant travel behavior was really focused on this kind of this immigrant effect, which said that once you accounted for things like time that folks have been in the United States, you've accounted for where they're living, what their income is, what their job, what their education is, there's still something unexplained in the fact that immigrants tend to use cars less and tend to use transit, biking, walking more than folks who have been born in the United States. And that's not a story that we can tell just with the census data or with travel data. And this goes back to our conversation around mobility justice. And one of the things for me is in the principles of mobility justice that the Untokening Network put out, which is a sort of loose coalition of planners of color, of advocates who have felt kind of tokenized in transportation spaces. One of their principles is valuing community information as data. And so sort of going back to the communities to learn what their, you know, what's accounting for these differences, what this potential immigrant effect is kind of where my entry point into this research was. So I was focused in the work that I've done, have been focused largely on cycling and trying to understand sort of what the patterns, the motivations, the barriers are around cycling in immigrant populations. And a lot of it comes down to the strength of social ties and social networks and the ability of these kind of supplemental forms of infrastructure, or human infrastructure, as Adonia Lugo has put it, really serve as backstops when the hard infrastructure isn't available. They serve as supports for when folks don't have resources to get around. They kind of create create an ability to draw on resources that you don't have. So folks, you might belong to a social organization that gives out bikes in exchange for volunteer time at certain events or something. And I found that this was relatively common among the folks that I interviewed in getting them cycling. Friends and family ties were important in kind of motivating or deterring folks from cycling, whether they thought it was great and they went on events together and they went riding up on trail rides and posted pictures on Facebook, or if they had heard stories from their family about how dangerous it was to cycle, and they were discouraged themselves, even though they may have wanted to try it. I think another important piece of information to keep in mind is this narrative that we have around what it means to be successful in the United States, and that narrative has been built up around the car. For folks who are new to the United States, you may not have a deep perspective of what life is like here, but you certainly have media to tell you what it is, and a lot of that media is driven by this narrative of success around car ownership. And so that's either something that you have to fight against if you want to keep using cycling as your main mode of transportation, or you embrace that narrative and decide that you are going to get a car and you're going to drive around. Tied up in that are some questions of intersections of other forms of identity. So for several of the women that I talked to in this particular project, they brought up issues around cultural narratives about what is proper for women to do, and cycling was not one of those proper things. Sort of going back to one of my interviewees talked about ancestral taboos around, like, not women can't ride a horse because it violates their sexual purity, and so those sorts of cultural narratives seem to carry forward. And then another consideration, I think, in this is sort of the experience as an immigrant in the United States, particularly after the time that I was conducting this initial study in 2014, where you have kind of the narrative of the state is that you don't belong and that you're criminalized, and then if you're out on a bicycle, that makes you both hyper visible in terms of standing out because there are so few cyclists, but in some ways invisible because there are so few cyclists, and so what you are trying to advocate for doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. So I think a lot of these kind of qualitative factors are really at play here, and those kind of network ties, I think, are some of the most important characteristics that I've come across in this line of work.
That's interesting, and I find being able to also hear from community members and people on the ground who are facing some of these barriers every day is probably also really insightful, and definitely deepens the perspective. I do want to just quickly announce the next CLE code word. So the next CLE code word is bridge, BRIDGE. So again, the next CLE code word is bridge. Okay. So Professor Karner, I would love to jump to you. And you and your colleagues have provided a pretty relatively accessible online tool called the Transit Equity Dashboard for students and communities to kind of see how well transit in several large cities connects communities with jobs and services and amenities that they need. And one of the topics that the dashboard includes is the ADA accessibility of transit. And you discussed that there is a lack of data to really analyze the equity in transit access for people with disabilities. So I would love to hear why there is insufficient data, and without it, how can policymakers really make sure to include the voices of those who are most affected by transportation inequities?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the dashboard. So for folks in the room, the dashboard, you can take a look. It's dashboard.transitcenter.org. So this is a project that I completed in collaboration with colleagues at University of Vermont and University of Toronto. And if you take a look, you'll see we cover 7 regions across the US where Transit Center, which is a national nonprofit that advocates for public transit in various ways in cities across the US. There are 7 regions where they're active and working, and they're interested in kind of tracking their impact. We also started undertaking the work right before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And so for the first couple months, we were kind of in this new COVID world. And so we quickly pivoted the initial scope to include a look at changes over time. So we pulled down data in all 7 regions over, I think we've got 14 months up there now. So all of 2020, Feb 2020 to Feb 2021, and then a few more date polls recently. So you can look at how transit service has changed over time, how it changed during the pandemic, which regions experienced initial major service cuts and then were able to bounce back, which ones experienced major service cuts and then have never really recovered, and then how those service cuts affect different demographic groups. So you see different patterns. Washington, DC looks different from Philadelphia, which looks different from San Francisco. So I guess just being, a kind of reflexive practitioner here and researcher, this, you could say, you're continuing this distributive focus. You're just looking at the distribution of transportation goods. This doesn't really embody a mobility justice framework. And I think that's a valid criticism. We did try to push back against that kind of narrow focus in many ways. So rather than looking just at, a single measure of transit access or a single way of defining like a quote environmental justice community, we break out all of the different demographic groups that we look at. We include lots of demographics that are not usually looked at, like essential workers and single parent households. We included dozens of different measures. So not just looking at access to jobs, right? There's that like kind of capital accumulation goal for public transit again, but we looked at access to healthcare, access to schools, access to food, access to healthy food, large grocers. So we included lots of different measures, and the measures that we included were informed by outreach and engagement that that Transit Center was doing with folks on the ground in these locations, which I think is pretty important. So we weren't just, engineers and planners sitting at our desks from on high, sending down these measures and saying these are the right ones, but we're actually listening to folks who use public transit and tailoring our work to reflect their concerns. So a couple other things we did that I think were pretty awesome were we looked at relative measures of accessibility. So access to all the different opportunities that I talked about. There are different ways to calculate it. And often folks will stop just at looking at public transit measures, but you can show that public transit systems are fair and equitable, right? Communities of color, low-income communities have a higher level of access. But if that level of access is lower than what you can get by the car, then like, is that actually a good level of access? Or should we be striving for a higher standard? And so we included an automobile measure for comparison to show how the two stack up against each other. We included consideration of fares. Affordability is often talked about in the literature, but often never analyzed for various technical reasons that I won't go into. But we were able to come up with a fare sensitive measure. So we were able to say, okay, if you only have $5 in a day to make a one-way trip, how does that affect your level of access? And for whom is access affected by that fare cap? And where it was available, we also looked at reliability of public transit service. So a lot of the data measures are based on static understandings of routes and schedules, right? So the transit provider gives us data about what they think the schedule is. But if you've ever taken transit, you know that the reality of transit doesn't often match the posted schedule. So we tried to take that into account using some real-time data where it was available. So a lot of innovations, I think that, are still kind of in a distributive frame, but trying to be more attuned to what folks who use transit actually need, rather than just doing the analysis and saying, okay, it's equitable, like let's move on to the next thing, right? So your question was about people with disabilities and ADA. So there is certainly a lack of data. A big piece of information that's missing in a lot of municipalities about sidewalks, sidewalk connectivity and sidewalk quality, like the presence of curb cuts, whether stops and stations are accessible, whether there are elevators, if there are elevators, do the elevators work, those types of things. I think though that going back to kind of the mobility justice framework and some of the stuff that Jesus mentioned, like what actually counts as data and whose data and whose perspectives count. Like there's plenty of qualitative information that you can get if you just talk with people with disabilities and ask them what their needs are. And it seems to me that engineers have an almost pathological inability to deal with data that are not numeric in nature. And I see this, I say this as a recovering engineer. I like have engineering colleagues who I love and work with all the time, but I'll talk about data for like an interview study that I'm doing or something. Like, oh, like what are you talking about? You don't have data. You have like conversations. So anyway, you just don't get it. But if you listen to people with disabilities, they'll tell you the bus drivers pass them by because they don't want to deploy the ramp. They don't want to take the extra time. When they actually get on a vehicle, the other passengers are mad because they've been delayed. The stations and stops are not physically accessible. Elevators don't work reliably. The paratransit dial-a-ride service is inconvenient, right? You have to schedule a day in advance. You have like a 3-hour window where they pick you up and drop you off. Like all of these things, like we can get data on them just by asking folks, but we can't really fit those data into the existing kind of equity analysis frameworks at agencies. And it's not just, this problem isn't just related to people with disabilities. One of the other insights, the great insights from the Untokening Collective that Jesus mentioned, is that identity influences vulnerability. So Black folks, other people of color, transgender people, they all experience public space differently, right? So if you go and talk to Black people who use public transit, they'll tell you like the presence of police on transit does not make me feel safer. If you talk to transgender people, they'll tell you I am harassed on public transit because of my appearance. Like all of these things can be learned and considered and incorporated into the actions of an agency that's making decisions about public transit, especially if they're espousing some equity concern, but they're just often not. And equity and environmental justice are kind of sidelined. We think that we can get at them by conducting like a one-off quantitative analysis or some kind of basic public engagement exercise, but it just doesn't work. So just last thing I'll say is like in Austin, we're a blueberry in a sea of red, we're a progressive city. The Capital Metro Board, our transit agency board, voted at the end of the summer to create a brand new police force to police the new system that they're creating. And this is an agency that is committed to equity. They've got anti-displacement funding in the new plan, like the right people in place. They're doing really good hires, but still making these kind of boneheaded decisions. So the data are out there. We just have to ask folks, what their needs are for particular groups, and then we need some way of incorporating that into existing decision-making processes.
That's helpful to think about, and I think it just really resonates with this importance of actually speaking to people who are facing these barriers, and rather than just getting the quantitative data, actually trying to understand the different factors that come into play with transportation and access to opportunity. So Professor Ellengold, I'd love to jump back over to you. And I recognize that you were previously a fair housing attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice and litigated cases under the Fair Housing Act, the ADA, Title II of the Civil Rights Act. And I would love to hear your perspective on how housing intersects with all the barriers that we've discussed today, including higher education and access to different forms of social and economic mobility.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. In my writing and thinking, I have more than once thought about the fact that higher education and housing are seen as kind of these twin pillars of social and economic mobility in the U.S. But as others have already alluded to or said flat out, for both, issues of actual mobility can make it impossible to actually take advantage of or achieve that kind of touted mobility opportunities. And so I think when you layer housing and higher education and transportation on top of one another, you see how these three structures work together to benefit certain folks and to harm other folks. So, as already has been mentioned, where we live defines so much about our lives and what we can access. It's where our children go to school, often funded by the tax base that funds that school. And without access to reliable and affordable and accessible transportation, where we live then also limits where we can work and build community and access services. So I think that when we think about how either transportation law or systems fail to service certain residential communities, then you see that certain communities get cut off from opportunity, from work and from school. In Atlanta, MARTA, for example, has deprioritized routes and shelters that serve primarily minority populations. And so they have longer wait times, and the routes don't go, the routes actually go further. So you have to spend more time on the bus route to get to where you want to go, things like that. When I lived in DC, it was just common knowledge that the closer you get to a metro stop, the more expensive the residential housing is. And so if you can't get between home and work, or home and school, or home and work and school, it's impossible to access those points of opportunities. So that's kind of from the transportation side. And then from the legal side, from the housing side, I litigated a very long case in Chicago about a municipality that had used eminent domain to get rid of public housing that had served 99% of residents who were Black. And it was after a lot of the public housing came down in Chicago and a lot of people had moved to this municipality. And so I represented both the United States and HUD, arguing that that itself was a fair housing violation. And I think that that's, that there was a question on the last panel about how Section 8 housing and mobility is part of this conversation. And I think that where states, municipalities, where people use the law to try and move out communities, what that means is it also then limits their access to the community they built, to jobs, to schools, to all the things that they've built. And when we don't have good transportation, it's again kind of a doubling down of that. So when we think about affordable housing or fair housing, I think we need to see it as more than just an access issue. So again, it speaks to the conversation that Alex was saying about what is mobility justice. It's more than just an access issue. It has to be thinking about access to what and what kind of barriers and burdens are put in place, not just to access to fair housing or to affordable housing, but what that means to access to opportunity. And transportation is such a huge piece of that I think we need to be thinking about all these things in tandem.
Can I just add to that? A lot of my work is at the intersection of housing and schools, but I also want to talk about schools and school districts because part of the intention with the paper that Jesus and Alex and I wrote was not only to talk and sort of challenge the transportation planning and transportation engineering sector, but also schools and school district and school policy, and to elevate the ways that the mobility justice framework could actually practically shift the way that districts think about their work as well, and in a couple of ways. And so one is, I just want to echo what Alex and Jesus have already said, like, listen to the people, listen to the young people, right? We don't actually have information, particularly in school districts with systems of choice, about what the experience of school travel is. What does it mean to get up at 5 a.m. to take a bus or to have a parent drive you to a school that's across the district or over district lines because it's a quote unquote better school? So we need more information from young people. We don't know, similar to what likewise, Jesus and Alex said about other populations. School buses, I did some work in Baltimore. They use the transit system. They have a full system of choice at the high school level. And young people are using the MTA, the public transit system. The transit drivers pass students up all the time. When they're on the buses, even if they're not policed per se, they are policed, right? There is a rampant criminalization of young people in public spaces, particularly young people of color, right? And so this experience really matters. And on the housing side, the school choice and the schools and housing side, right? Like as Professor Ellengold just alluded to, where you live really sort of captures a lot of what you have access to and what is available to you. And so the segregative effects of housing are by default the segregative effects of schooling and vice versa. And we know that historically those things were intentionally tied, and we use school facility planning and school facility policies and construction policies as ways to actually create segregated neighborhoods and vice versa. I recently completed a study on school and housing segregation and growth management policies in Howard and Baltimore counties here in Maryland. And we were looking specifically at the school district policy mechanism of school attendance rezoning. And so this is when schools design the attendance boundaries for an individual school site, right? So the catchment areas. And in Maryland, we have countywide school districts. So those catchment areas are sort of more than like a neighborhood school. Like my work in Philly, your catchment area may be sort of a 5-block radius or something pretty small, right? In Maryland, those are going to be a little bit bigger. But I think that what the school districts in general don't think about when they make these boundaries is that they're not intentional about actually operationalizing the disruption of segregative patterns. They're not actually thinking about desegregation outcomes and what they can actually do and how they can actually, gerrymander, for lack of a better term, towards desegregation and towards integration to mitigate harms. And part of that is that they're not necessarily acknowledging the historic and cumulative and compounding negative impacts of what the current sort of landscape looks like. And this, again, is a moment where the mobility justice framework and its attention to historical precedent and sort of actually acknowledging the historical trajectory of our policy and legal structures. There are ways to operationalize that, but it's really hard for policymaking bodies and practitioners to think historically and to sort of grapple with that. But there's a way in which we can actually mitigate or begin to sort of chip away at those historic harms if we're actually intentional about it, right? School siting policy is transportation policy, is housing policy, right? But school districts are doing that in a vacuum from the planners and the affordable housing advocates and the transportation planners in the municipal and regional jurisdictions. That again, the jurisdictional and legal silos between these sectors is actually creates a lot of philosophical, but also practical challenges to managing this. And so the question is, how do we help operationalize mobility justice for practitioners that are operating with a lot of constraints in a legal and policy framework?
Great, and thanks for sharing your perspective with that. And I think that really leads to my next question, which I know is a large question, but we do have a lot of law students here, people who are interested in law and policy, and I would love to hear from anyone who's feels comfortable answering this question, because I know it's a big one. What are some legal remedies or policy remedies for some of these barriers that we've mentioned?
I can jump in quickly because I've done a little bit of work on the legal side with a colleague of mine at Public Advocates, which is a public interest law firm in San Francisco. So I've done some work with Richard Marcantonio, who's a managing attorney there. So we looked at Title VI, and so Title VI is like one of the main ways that transit agencies think about equity and justice related issues. And so it's kind of like, it's not exactly like legal compliance, it's more like regulatory compliance. So DOT has operationalized Title VI and various regulations that they kind of push out to the organizations that receive funding from them. So Federal Transit Administration has a whole set of guidelines that transit agencies have to adhere to. And the ways that FTA recommends transit agencies comply with Title VI are very deficient, I would argue. They're wholly based in a very narrow distributive framework that only takes into account who lives near public transit, and how if you're proposing a new line and you want to look at the equity impacts or the civil rights impacts, you just have to look at who lives near that line, their demographic composition, and then you compare that to the service area and see if there are differences. And if there are differences, there might be something that you have to mitigate. But that's it, like nothing else, nothing about the stuff that we've talked about from a kind of mobility justice perspective, nothing about policing, nothing necessarily about ADA access, nothing about displacement, which is like just such a huge and obvious issue that it's really difficult to get our heads around for some of the reasons that Ariel was talking about. All these decisions about land use and transportation are being made by separate folks, and the needs of real estate capital drive a lot of land use decisions. So developers are often able to get what they want and create units that will sell to the highest bidder, and it's difficult to fight against that. Anyway, that's a conversation for another day. But I think that the Title VI regulations could potentially be strengthened. And Federal Transit Administration, for example, could require more from its agencies, right? Like they would have to do better community engagement. They would have to do more robust quantitative analyses to figure out exactly what's going on. The Federal Transit Administration, when they're reviewing the stuff that the agencies are doing, could put on their like critical thinking hat and think about, is the agency trying to cook the books on this particular project? Like, can we kind of see through what they're doing? But they've been very reluctant to push back on agency work in any regard. So those things can be done. The big problem, or one of the big issues in Title VI work related to transportation, is that, as I'm sure folks in the Zoom room know, individuals cannot sue if they feel that they've been discriminated against because of a transportation decision. If they're making a disparate impact claim, they cannot file a lawsuit. They can only bring a lawsuit if they're alleging intentional discrimination under Title VI, which is very difficult to prove. And the reason for that is a Sandoval case. And so that means that all of the civil rights complaints have to be adjudicated through this administrative complaint pathway through DOT. And whether or not those claims are taken seriously depends on who the political appointees are in those agencies. So right now we have an administration that's favorable to these ideas around equity and justice. So they're taking civil rights complaints seriously, but in 2 years we may have a different administration. And so there's no legal vehicle, no redress for communities that they can take. They can't file a lawsuit, they can't file an administrative complaint. So their hands are, they can't really do anything through those official channels. They have to do something else. So those are that's the landscape of legal issues that I see.
So can I just ask a question that, because we obviously have an attorney on our panel that I hope Kate has something to say, but I have a question that's related to this, and it's related to work that I've been doing with some working groups convened by folks that are mostly civil rights attorneys, convened by PRAC, the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, looking at the intersection of housing and school segregation. And so it's this puzzle that like the legal remedies are reactive, right? After harm has been inflicted. But it seems to me that that's really problematic because the harms that are inflicted are inflicted through the things that we're talking about are so durable, right? So you build a transit system, you can't unbuild it as a legal remedy after the fact, right? So I'm really curious how we can think about the intersection of sort of the legal remedies and sort of the legal tools that we have in conjunction with the policy and the regulatory and the planning frameworks at the front end which actually would mean that we would be creating durable systems that the harms are the exception to the rule, as opposed to the reaction to what seems to be the rule, which is our systems that sort of we're in this like perpetual. I just feel like we're always catching up, right? The civil rights lawsuits are always catching up because we have to, we're responding after the fact. And so I know that might be like a hard sell in a room full of lawyers, but I don't know. So I just wanted to insert that, and then Kate, maybe you can speak to that, because it seems like you kind of play and do research and are in spaces kind of on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point. I think that for aspiring civil rights lawyers, it's really difficult to learn how limited the civil rights laws are in terms of making big structural change. You are right, they are reactive. Alex is right that although disparate treatment, intentional discrimination, and disparate impact were originally included kind of in the Civil Rights Act, those have been pulled back. Alex explained in Title VI, in Gross, the ADEA, the ADEA, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, they said there is no disparate impact. In Title VIII, the Fair Housing Act, inclusive communities came out a couple of years ago, which made it more difficult to bring a disparate impact case. And so even those more structural tools that we have that are still reactive but are structural have been pulled back. And so I think that there are a couple of things to think about. One is that lawyering is not just litigating. And so there are a lot of community lawyers out there who are doing a lot of things that, that a lot of folks on this panel have talked about, talking to communities, putting community voices first, doing what needs to be done from the community's perspective. And that sometimes means advocating in municipal meetings, right, for something to change as a policy is getting put forth. So if Austin is thinking about putting in a new, let's bring capital to Austin, and not thinking about who the riders are who use public transit in Austin, lawyers can often be in those rooms trying to explain to policymakers who are also often lawyers, so they speak the same language, why that's a problem. So I think that the idea of making lawyering a bigger umbrella than just litigating is really important. I also think that, most policymakers, especially at the federal level, are also lawyers. So to think about going into policy work, I'll give an example from the Fair Housing Act, it's not actually part of the Fair Housing Act, it's part of the National Housing Act. In order to get money from HUD, which almost every municipality in the country does, the municipality has to first submit something called an AI, an analysis of impediments to fair housing. And those are basically kind of rubber stamped at HUD. And I think that you could use that idea at DOT, right? In order to get money to build your transportation program, you have to show the agency giving you the money, the federal government, that you're going to use the money in a way that promotes mobility justice or promotes equity or equitable access, or however it would be framed. So I think that as we think about it's a multi-pronged approach. It's lawyers in the room as community lawyers before policy decisions are made. It's changing regulation and the way that especially in terms of Title VI, and when communities get money from the federal government, how they show that they're not violating Title VI. And then it is also using the tools of litigation that we have through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other mechanisms, and to push on some of these more disparate impact, kind of creative, seeking injunctive relief rather than just monetary damages. So nothing about what you said, Ariel, was wrong about how the civil rights laws work. And I think it requires, in our current system of the civil rights law, without additional laws being passed or additional constitutional protections being passed, we have to think really creatively, I think, about what spaces lawyers need to be in and how to use these as a multi-pronged approach. So I don't know how helpful that is, but that's my 3 cents.
Well,
oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say thank you for that. And it makes me think about, similar to Alex, sort of as my own reflexive practitioner, right? I think about why and how I do the work that I do, but also from where I do it. And so that I could be doing this kind of advocacy work in lots of spaces, but I choose to be at an institution of higher ed because I also really care about teaching. So that there's a way in which how we train our current leaders reproduces the sort of siloed nature, right? And so if we as researchers and as educators in higher ed can figure out ways to bring a mobility justice frame, which is inherently multi-scalar and multi-sectoral and historical and contextually specific, right, to our work. I teach in a planning program and I teach a class about public education, right, to help planners try to understand and sensitize themselves to the extent to which our work actually deeply affects the work of school districts and of kids and families. I also am an adjunct professor at the Penn Graduate School of Education in their mid-career doctoral program. And so I teach superintendents and school directors who are getting an EDD on sort of planning and urban studies 101 to help them understand the ways in which many of the things they're dealing with in their school system are the function of things that transportation planners are doing or things going on with Title VI right? I mean, things that and we don't all have to be experts in everything, but figuring out sort of how we train and think about ourselves and the next generation of people we're talking about in more, I don't know, comprehensive or again, sort of cross-sector thinking. It's we still need specialization, but we also need to be attuned and sensitive across disciplines. And so there's an education component here, I think, as well.
That's really helpful. And
Can I just jump in quickly, Michaela?
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, I love this conversation. I think, yeah, like pedagogy is super important. Who we're talking to is super important. I've tried, I don't know if there's probably not any UT engineering professors on this call, but, I've tried to teach over in the UT engineering school and they've said like, oh, we don't want you here. Like there's not, you don't have enough equations in your lectures. So you're not going to teach. So like, I do have engineering students come and take my class. I do try to do what Ariel was talking about with my planning students too. I'm teaching a class mobility justice this semester. So like trying to get them thinking in this way. I really like what Professor Ellengold said too about like, there are ways for lawyers to work that are not necessarily litigation, doing advocacy and activism. And one of the first, like in my early graduate studies, one of the first books I read was From the Ground Up, this book by Luke Cole, great environmental justice attorney. And he had this quote in the book that like, once you take the fight out of the streets and into the courts, you've lost something or you kind of sap the strength of the movement. People become complacent and then you're kind of playing on like the state's court and whatever industry you're fighting with, you're playing on their court. And so one thing that we haven't really talked about is just like direct action, advocacy, and kind of organizing on the ground. I think like that has to be a key piece of any kind of mobility justice framework too. So I'll stop there.
I just want to kind of jump in here too. I think there's also a role for for organizations to think about who is filling the jobs that they're posting, right? So one of the, I've done a study of state departments of transportation to understand how they're embedding equity into their decision-making processes. And one of the kind of most forward-thinking DOTs and one who's doing the most in this kind of space, the work is not led by a planner and an engineer, it's led by a community development person who has expertise in housing, but working in transportation, managing an arts fellowship to improve their community engagement, doing deep work with unhoused communities around that has a large Native American population, and trying to understand like how do we respect tradition while also providing services, while also keeping the public right of way safe. And I think a lot of the challenge in these organizations is that folks are really interested in promoting equity, at least in some places, but don't know how to do it because they haven't had training, where they don't have colleagues who do that kind of work, or they haven't done it because they haven't been pressured to do it because there's no policy that directed it. But now that there is some kind of federal pressure to advance racial equity in policy, now they're starting to think about how do we do this because we have to. And I think there's a little bit of momentum that builds up, that even when the administration changes and there's no remedy, there's no administrative remedy or no legal remedy, there's at least some kind of nuggets that are in the background that might hopefully carry forward in the next cycle.
That's helpful, and I appreciate all of those perspectives. And I think it's a good place to end before we do our Q&A, because I think it also reminds a lot of the law students, including me on this call, that their advocacy and that out of court experience and work is really important for advocating for these issues, and listening to the community members and just being able to hear different perspectives is really important. So before we go into Q&A, I would like to announce the third and final CLE code word. So the third and final CLE code word for this session is subway, SUBWAY, subway. And we have some time for questions. So I would love to bring some of our participants that were here with able to submit questions through the Q&A. So the first question we have is, do you see a tension between the need to get new riders out of cars and onto transit for climate and road safety goals, which might mean targeting new transit improvements toward wealthier white users, and the need to improve services for existing riders in the name of spatial and service level equity?
I can probably feel that. I don't know, Jesus, do you want to take a crack?
If you want to start, Alex, maybe
Okay, a couple points. I guess my answer is no. I think if you make public transit better, more people will use public transit. It's not about necessarily targeting one demographic group or another. And we currently have a situation in this country where even the people who, like the local bus rider who I would love City of Austin to consider in their planning efforts, even those folks are trying really hard to get off the bus. They're trying really hard to buy a car because service is so poor. There's literature, lots of research out of UCLA looking at how access to credit, low-cost credit, has just decimated public transit ridership across the United States. So I think if I was a public transit agency looking at this research and thinking about like, what should I do? I would just be thinking about like, how can I stop the bleeding, especially in the wake of COVID-19 and all the service cuts that agencies have endured. And I think the best way to do that is to focus on people who need public transit the most. Start there, make public transit better for them, they'll ride. If you make public transit better in general, more people will ride. The evidence around like targeting specific like gold-plated commuter systems to like white wealthy riders, I think is not very positive in terms of revenue generated, mode shift, ridership. So I wouldn't necessarily be pursuing those ends personally.
I just might add that we need to think about what the goal of public transit is. Should we be thinking about it as a revenue generating entity, or do we really need to be thinking about it as a public good and funding it like we would any other public good? And so that kind of, I think, resolves some of the tension. I think a lot of this is also a land use question, not really a transportation, or less, not solely a transportation question. You can't provide adequate and efficient transit service in the sprawling cities that we have. And so I think this is kind of a long-term problem too.
Yeah, we don't ask the fire department if it made a profit or
Right.
we're not like looking at the balance sheet of the library.
Yeah,
It's like we should
exactly.
be public transit way. I agree.
Right. I would also just add that I think that maybe be so bold as to say that a mobility justice framework would sort of reject the terms of that question, because we actually want to think about the folks that have systematically been most disadvantaged in our decision making, and actually decentering them would violate the fundamental principles of what we're getting at. Caesar McDowell, who's up at MIT and does a lot of work on public deliberation and sort of community engagement, but he has a lovely TED talk and does a lot of research on thinking about designing at the margins, right? And that's sort of a fundamental value that you hold central, that if we think about designing for the most marginalized and minoritized populations last, which is what we do in general around our systems, the systems will never work for them because it's always the last thing that we're thinking about. And so I would say we need to flip the script and sort of reject the tension. And I think, Alex and Jesus offered a lot of practical ways that we can do that. But I think from a philosophical and sort of ethical perspective, the mobility justice framework actually offers us a very different path and sort of a different imperative for what we should be doing.
That's helpful. Thank you. And I appreciate all of those perspectives. I do want to be mindful of everyone's time and also the participants' time, and being able to take some time for lunch before we proceed with the keynote speaker and the rest of the day. So panelists, thank you so much for being here and being willing to talk about such an important issue and sharing your research and perspective. And audience, please join me for a virtual applause for our panelists. And I know that, this is something that a lot of participants are really going to appreciate. So thank you again. So participants and panelists, we will now have a break for lunch, and we will begin the keynote address by Professor Deborah Archer at 12:15. So feel free to take this time. You can stay on the call and turn off your video, or you are more than welcome to hop off and hop back on right before 12:15.